Janet Myers, and of course the reason why most of us are here tonight, Ms. Carrie Christensen. You must stand. As well as our advisory council. We have a wonderful advisory council that really does give us a lot of guidance as to what you're looking for in the community. So we've been involved in this for about 18 months to 2 years. And I just have a quick question for you all, and I'm hoping that you will participate in this. If anybody here has been affected by mental illness, yourself, a friend, anybody, raise your hand. Keep your hand up. Wow. Don't put your hand down. Do not put your hand down. If anybody here has been affected or knows somebody affected with addiction, put your hand up. If anybody here has been stressed, frustrated, anything, put your hand up. Now look around you. Look around you. I ask you to do this not so you realize you're not alone, but to realize that you have people around you who get it. The biggest thing we need to do is we need to start that conversation. I have a bracelet that I wear every day from one of my very dearest friends, and it says, "Dare to disturb the universe." And now, as most of you know, it can be a little bumpy, so it's not for that. But what it is, it reminds me to go outside of my comfort zone. And sometimes that comfort zone is getting to have that conversation with somebody that you may not want to. So when you look around you and you see somebody who might be struggling, who might need that extra hand up, might need that resource, might need that good morning, it's nice to see you, you value, disturb their universe. Help them get the help that they need. Thank you so much for being here, and I will turn this over to Kim, and I look forward to visiting with all of you later in the evening.
Thank you to Louise and Lee, and you can see it's very personal for them. When she asked about the stress, I put both hands up. If you're stressed and frustrated, I think we've all been there, and that's an important point to make. Disturb the universe. Dare to disturb them. Okay? Ask. Just ask. I'd like to introduce the CEO of All Health Network, Bill Hendricks. Come up to the stage, please. Say a few words.
Welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us tonight. Dr. Brene Brown rightly points out that all of us are created to seek connection with other people, and that trauma, mental illness, and addiction too often separate us from the love and belonging that we as humans require. Dr. Brown has described how shame and a sense of unworthiness silences and isolates us at the very moment when we need to connect and communicate with others. Through her research and her personal story, she has empowered countless individuals struggling with trauma, mental illness, addiction, and other types of human suffering to have the courage to acknowledge their own vulnerabilities and seek connection and support. In her book, Daring Greatly, Dr. Brown writes, "Love and belonging are irreducible needs of all men, women, and children. We are hardwired for connection. It's what gives us purpose and meaning in our lives. The absence of love, belonging, and connection always leads to suffering." So what does like minds, leaders take action really mean? I believe that Brad Feld coming here tonight shows exactly what it means. Like minds means we share an understanding that we all seek connection, but that mental illness and addiction often leave us feeling worthless and alone. Leaders take action means that as leaders we acknowledge our own vulnerabilities so that those in need can also recognize their needs and seek the help that they deserve. It's not an easy way to lead, but it is perhaps the best way for us to help and support others in their efforts to live healthy and purposeful and productive lives. As we prepare to hear Brad's story tonight, I will end with my favorite Brene Brown quote, which she actually borrowed from Theodore Roosevelt. But it goes like this: "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done better, the credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, and who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again. Because there's no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end of the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. Thank you for standing up for those with mental health and addictions. Please don't be afraid to share your own vulnerabilities as you encourage others to find solutions to their personal challenges. Supporting one another and being connected is why we are here. In closing, I would like to thank all of you for attending tonight, and I would especially like to thank those of you who made donations to support suicide prevention, suicide awareness, and staff training. And now I would like to introduce Lori Elliott, Vice President of Outpatient Services at All Health. Lori will discuss her experiences working with All Health Network's disaster response and community preparedness team. Her team has responded to multiple events in recent months, and we're so grateful to Lori and her team for being there to serve others when disaster strikes. Lori?
Thank you. Tonight is about becoming aware of mental illness and mental health so that we as leaders can take action in our homes and in our neighborhoods, where we work, and in our communities. And All Health Network, as a leader in behavioral health, gets to do that every day. So as Bill said, I'm going to give you just a couple examples. I'll just be up here a couple hours is all. And then we'll meet Brad and hear more from him. So recently in our national headlines, we hear over and over about sexual assault against children, against youth, and against women. The Me Too campaign is talked about on TV over and over. And that shows us how prevalent sexual assault and sexual abuse is. And more recently, in our own local headlines, we have heard about the loss and experienced the loss of 2 of our police officers who were murdered when they responded to situations while they were on duty. When the headlines of these traumatic experiences change and the days pass, individuals impacted by these events, they try to move on and they try to heal. Family members and friends circle the wagons, they try to support them, and sometimes that's enough. And sometimes kids just go back to school when they're not healed. Adults, we take one step, put it in front of the other, and go back to work. We go back to your workplace. We go back to my workplace. And we still need help. The support of family and friends is not always enough. All too often, the impact of unexpected events and the ongoing behavioral health challenges that result need more than our family and friends. And sometimes we need to be brave enough to reach out and get professional help. All Health Network has as its core the mission to step up and support and treat individuals who are brave enough to ask for that professional help. This past month, on New Year's Eve, when Deputy Zachary Parrish was killed responding to the Copper Canyon apartments, All Health Network was part of the team that supported the residents at the Copper Canyon apartments. We partnered with Douglas County Sheriff, with the emergency managers, and with the advocates that worked with the survivors of that situation. On New Year's Eve, we were actually at the Emergency Operations Center. We are called directly from the emergency managers or our emergency support function lead in our area. 2 days later, we provided them with written materials about how to cope after something horrific like this happens. We also partnered one evening with the Douglas County Sheriffs and with the management team at the apartment complex to support the individuals in 220 apartments that were impacted by this event. When we hear this situation on TV, we hear about the death, we hear about the officers, and yet all of us have been impacted in some way by that event or the loss of the even more recent death of another officer. Some of these families woke up at 5:30 in the morning to gunshot. Some of them had bullets through their wall. Some of them had their windows blown out. That's not something that any of us ever expect. So for those individuals, we stepped up even farther, and we got those individuals connected with ongoing care at one of our outpatient locations. When children are involved in trauma, we step it up again, and we have the luxury of having individuals from in five of our school districts. We have behavioral health clinicians who are in 20 schools so that kids can see a behavioral health clinician without even leaving the school. They can go to class, they can go see their counselor, and then they can go back to class. We're aware that many of our students go home to situations that have significant challenges. Sometimes it's parents who struggle with the relationship with each other. Sometimes it's someone in their family who has an addiction challenge, or they're challenged with depression, or they're challenged with anxiety. So we want to come alongside those students so that when they're at school, they can focus on education and they can have emotional support while they're there. We serve children, youth, and families, and adults of all socioeconomic statuses, all levels of education, all insurances. We come alongside those individuals and we provide them evidence-based care so that they can heal and go on and thrive in life. Tonight I just want to thank you for taking time to learn about mental health. All of us at one time or another need support, including our family and our friends, and sometimes we need professional support as well. So when you see that, as Bill said, as Louise said, I want to encourage you to reach out and offer support yourself. And then if you need, or that individual needs extra support, All Health Network and other health care facilities in our area, we're there for you. Thank you.
Thank you to Lori and Bill. I think that gives you a lot of perspective, because we, and I can speak with some authority there, in the news business cover the event and sometimes the immediate people around there. When you think of the hundreds of people that live in that apartment complex, and then they go to work, and then they go to school, and then a month later they hear about another incident or something triggers a memory, and no one else around them necessarily knows that. Life doesn't just move on instantly. So thank you to All Health Network for providing those resources, because they're, by the grace of God, go out. We never know when that's going to be next door to us and our reaction and how we're going to feel and how we're going to cope. And it's okay to ask for help. So you all came here to see one person, mostly, and hear from our keynote speaker, Brad Feld, who will be joined by Like Minds co-chair, Louise Richardson. Brad, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on Brad, because I think what's important when we talk about mental health is the highs are the highs and the lows are the lows. And most high achieving individuals see both, because that's why they got there. You know, you don't achieve success without failure, and you don't deal with all the emotions that go along with it. So it's important you know a little bit about his background. He was and has been an early stage investor and entrepreneur since 1987. Prior to co-founding Foundry Group, he founded Modus Venture Capital. Prior to that, founded Intensity Ventures. He is also a co-founder of Techstars. He is a writer and a speaker on a variety of venture capital investing topics and entrepreneurship. Know an entrepreneur and they've got their ideas are spinning 24/7, right? All the time. And the partner of an entrepreneur. Wow, that's special. I'm just saying, boy, oh boy, enjoy the ride. He has written a number of books as part of the Startup Revolution series, and he writes blogs, Feld Thoughts, and Venture Deals. I urge you to read Feld Thoughts. Awesome, awesome stuff. I mean, it's like you go, yes, I get that, been there. He holds a Bachelor of Science and Master of Sciences degree in Management Science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Don't get that. That means super smart. He's also an art collector and a long-distance runner. Any runners in the crowd? Yeah? No. Yeah, couple? Okay, yay. He has completed 25 marathons as part of his mission to finish a marathon in each of the 50 states. How's that? Oh my gosh, that's why you live in Colorado, because it's a good place to train. So please welcome Brad. Squeeze, come on up here. Squeeze is going to help the conversation. Louise doesn't like to talk.
Can we all thank Kim for being here tonight? She, we all know how because she believes in this, not because she's Carrie's sister, but because she truly does believe in making a difference in our community. So, Kim, thank you very much. So, okay, we get to sit. So, I have had the pleasure of hearing Brad speak before and have been in awe of him. And when I found out that he was willing, with the little Carrie Christensen arms with me, when he was willing to share his thoughts and his time with us tonight, I thought, what a perfect fit. In hearing Brad's story, he has had a very interesting journey with mental health. And I would really love for you to talk about that journey and to let us know how you took it out from, as he put it, hiding in plain sight to something that he is choosing to share with all of us. So with that, Brad.
Everybody in the back can see okay? Great. So I'll start with about a 15-minute story or so that just sort of walks through 3 key points in my life. And then I think we've got some questions, and I think at the end we've got some Q&A that we've got some time for people to have questions. My first realization and experience and internal acknowledgement around depression happened in 1991 when I was 25 years old. So teleport yourself, for those of you that were alive in 1991. It looks like a lot of people in this room. Back to the early 90s. And at the time I was living in Boston. I was running my first company, a company that was named Feld Technology. So rule number 1 is don't name a company after yourself, because then you have all this identity dynamics that you've got to deal with. I was involved in 3 things simultaneously that were really the trigger of this first depressive episode. So up to that point, I'd been, very successful, sort of always the youngest person in the room. My wife Amy now calls me the old boy wonder. Then I was the young boy wonder. And 3 things happened. The first was I had married my high school girlfriend, not my wife Amy, and we split up. So I was going through my first major relationship breakup and sort of my first real failure in that context. Second is I had just gotten thrown out of a PhD program that I was part of, and I deserved to get thrown out. They like to say that I can come back anytime, but my view was not only was I thrown out, but I have no interest in ever going back. I was running a business, and I really was not interested in being a professor, which was the only reason for me to get the PhD that I was in the program for. But it was the first time I had real academic failure as well. The third thing that was going on was my first company was doing quite well, but I was very bored. It had become routine, and I wasn't really feeling challenged. Sort of the struggles and the stresses were the same, and I had a partner, and I had a good relationship with my business partner, but I think both of us were sort of in this place where it just wasn't that stimulating. These 3 things triggered what ended up being about a 2 to 3 year depressive episode. first one that I was really conscious of. About a year in, I started doing therapy at the behest of my then girlfriend, now wife, Amy, who I got together with shortly after my first relationship broke up. My PhD advisor, or at this point my ex-PhD advisor, also encouraged me to do therapy, and he actually connected me with his psychiatrist, which was a very interesting sort of paternalistic dynamic that turned out to be very helpful because I felt very protected and very safe, had a deep relationship with this person. Interestingly, my parental dynamics with my parents, my father's now a retired endocrinologist and my mom's an artist, was profoundly unhelpful. My father's reaction to it was kind of, when I started saying I thought I might be depressed, was shake it off. I grew up in a household where, you know, I would like to say there was plenty of anxiety. My parents were successful, but it was sort of classic Jewish anxiety, which now I know is somatic because we're always afraid the Cossacks are going to come take us away at some point and disappear. So I had this environment that I grew up in where sort of this stuff wasn't okay, right? It wasn't okay in the context of even talking about it or exploring it, just get over it. So I went on a journey that was a very powerful one that I was incredibly ashamed of. So I was ashamed of being depressed. I was ashamed of seeing a psychiatrist. You go back to leadership in the early 90s, like leaders have to be strong, you have to like never show any weakness, and you have to be confident that everything is going to go great, and you know, that was the messaging. And so I was sort of struggling against the backdrop of that. On top of it, it turns out that the clinical anxiety disorder I have is obsessive compulsive disorder. And for those of you that are not super tuned into OCD, the difficult part of OCD is that we all have we all have obsessions and we all have compulsions, but it's the link between the two that's really insidious. And for me, it was an irrational linkage. So, for example, when I walked down the streets of Boston, if I didn't make every cigarette that I saw on the streets of Boston parallel to the sidewalk, my mother would die. Or if I didn't shut my computer down a certain way in a certain order, we'd lose a client. My magic number was 3, and if I didn't do something 3 times, I had to do it 3 times 3 times, or 9. And if I didn't get it 9 times right, I had to do it 27 times. And if you have to do something 27 times, you're going to get it fucking right, because you don't want to have to do it 81 times. And so I had this incredible cognitive load that was going on around this sort of struggling with this anxiety disorder. I was really fortunate that my business partner, Dave, and my now wife, Amy, who were really the only 2 people that I talked to about this other than my therapist and my PhD advisor, were incredibly supportive. And Dave didn't really understand what was going on with me at the time, but as a business partner, he was very helpful. And Amy, as a girlfriend, now wife, was extraordinary in terms of her patience. Interestingly, at this time, and I'll skip to the next one in a sec, I was very functional. So I today describe myself as being a very functional depressive. So it took me all of my energy to get out of bed in the morning. But I'd get to the office. I was working, before I was depressed, I was probably working 80 to 100 hours a week. I could do 8 to 10 hours a day of high intensity, serious work. And then I'd go home and I'd sit in the bathtub for 3 hours. Or I'd lay on the couch and stare at the ceiling. I had no energy to do anything. I had no interest in doing anything. Getting out of bed on the weekends was difficult. But for that sort of work component, you know, if you knew me, you'd say, hey, he seems a little off, or he's a little flat, or I haven't seen Brad around that much. But I was able to engage. The last piece of that first experience was, because it was really the first time that I acknowledged that I was depressed, I was worried that I was going to feel this way for the rest of my life, and that was really difficult. And I was fortunate that I had, again, a couple of people that were supportive, but, you know, the first year, the first 18 months, by year 2 of this, I started to be fearful that this was how I was going to feel the rest of my life, and that was not okay. That just added to the tension. My second depressive episode was in 2001. So for those of you that remember 2001, bunch of things happened. The first was on the back end of 3 or 4 years of incredible technology growth in my world and success around the internet investing and company creation, the internet bubble started to collapse. And 2001 was a total shit show for me. In that year, I ended up shutting down about 10 companies that we were investors in. Everywhere I went, every day was a different set of problems. And then I was in New York. I took a red eye from San Francisco to New York overnight, the night of September 10th, and was in Midtown New York, sleeping in a hotel, the Benjamin Hotel, on September 11th, when the first World Trade Center collapsed. And I woke up to a randomly set alarm clock. I had taken the red eye, and I just laid down for a couple hours because I didn't have a meeting till noon. And I woke up to whoever had been in the room before me had set the alarm clock for, I don't know, 9:30 or whatever. And somebody was on the radio. It turned out it was Imus, for those of you that remember Imus, talking about how a World Trade Center had fallen, had collapsed. And I was like, that is bullshit. Like, this is some thing. And I turned on TV, which I never do. And of course, I saw the second building collapse on TV. And I had this incredible reaction to it of just feeling terrified, not safe, in the city, completely exhausted at this period of time where I had been physically exhausted, physiologically exhausted, emotionally exhausted from all the work that I've been doing. And I ended up, that triggered what ended up being about a 3-month depressive episode. In that one, and this is where the phrase for me, hidden in plain sight, comes from, is that I was depressed, but so was most of the United States. Right? Everybody was really sort of confused and disoriented, and it was difficult, and so even though I was really depressed, I didn't stand out from the tone that was going on as everybody's working through this. So I didn't think that much of it. I just sort of got through it, and because I had gotten through the depression the last time, I knew that I'd get out of the depression cycle at some point. And so, at some point I was better, and off we went. The third major depressive episode for me was the critical turning point in terms of being public about my own struggles with mental health. And the way this unfolded was, it started in the spring of 2012. And in the spring of 2012, by the way, in 2012, my world was going great. Fantastic relationship with this woman named Amy for many years, living in Colorado, which I absolutely love living in. My business life at Foundry Group was doing great. We had a number of significant successes, and our business and our world was going very well. My personal life outside of work was very stimulating, and I was in very, very good physical shape. So in April, I ran a 50-mile race, which was the first time I ran a 50-mile race. And so when I look back at my blog posts around, there was too much training. I actually wrote a blog post that this is too much running given all the other things I'm doing before I ran the race. I ran the race, and I did not recover. I physically recovered in about a week. But I ran the race on a Saturday, and on a Monday I had meetings in San Francisco. And I was on the road all week, and then I went home for the weekend, and then I was on the road all the following week. And I never really recovered physiologically through the next couple of months. I then went on a bicycle trip with one of my partners, Seth, for his 40th birthday in Slovenia. And on the last day of the trip, I had a near-death bike accident. I went for a 13-mile run before the bike ride because I was tired of riding bikes because I didn't like to ride bikes. And I ran up and over a mountain and down a mountain that they then rode their bikes over. I laid down, I took a nap for about an hour. And when they came down, a bike came out of the car that was following us, and I got on the bike. Now, anybody that's run 13 miles and taken a nap for an hour, you would never get behind the wheel of a car, let alone on a bicycle. Stupidest thing in the world. And within a mile, I had smashed into my partner Ryan, and if I hadn't smashed into Ryan, I would have gone over a bridge that I had to make a left turn on. My brain was nowhere in this. So I had a serious accident, really beat myself up pretty good. And from Slovenia, I went to New York and spent a month in New York with Amy in September. And I never really recovered from that. Like, I never took care of myself, just working hard, 5 o'clock in the morning, my sort of normal life. And on no running and no training, I ran a marathon in October. So I was really depleting myself physiologically. I then ended up with a kidney stone, which required surgery. no surprise that I ended up with a kidney stone given all this other stuff. I'm not prone to kidney stones, but my body was trying to tell me something. And, you know, I took most of December off, but I was, you know, post-surgery, so for 2 weeks I was stoned on Vicodin, and for the next 2 weeks it was the end of the year, so for me, December is always a difficult month. And I went to CES, which is a major computer show, the first week of January. Within 2 hours of getting to Las Vegas, I was in my room with the shades drawn, in bed with a pillow over my head, and I knew I was in a deep depression. And I sort of didn't really deal with it till about March, beginning of March. On Valentine's Day, Amy and I went out to dinner, and I said to her, I think I'm feeling better. Like it's been a couple of weeks that was tough, but I feel like I'm out of it. And by the end of February, I had totally face planted, and I was in a deeper depression than I probably was in my 20s. Now, when I go back and look at what I wrote, I blogged on a daily basis, and I wrote a bunch of stuff, and you can see me writing about feeling depressed as early as October of 2012. So I was very tuned into the fact that I was completely depleted, but I had no consciousness of what was going on. And in this time period, once I acknowledged it, because I had been writing publicly about it, I decided that I've been writing for 10, 12 years publicly. I'd be bullshitting myself as well as everybody that read anything about what was going on and anything that I wrote if I wasn't open about this. In addition, there had been several high-profile suicides in 2012 of people in the entrepreneurial community. And each person, sort of the view of them the day before they committed suicide was they were doing great. Right? They had stresses, but there was sort of this manic, you know, the manic high before the suicide was very prevalent. And I just made this conscious decision that I was going to be open about this and see where it went. In the context of this, and over the depressive episode lasted for another 3 months, I probably talked to 100 or so entrepreneurs or investors, many of which names you'd recognize, some extremely successful and visible. And in a lot of cases, I was the first person they had ever talked to about their struggles with depression. And that's when I really had this understanding of how deep this stigma was. And I was aware of it, and I had some people, you know, my father said to me, why are you writing about this stuff? The bad guys are going to get you. And my response to him is, Dad, fuck the bad guys. Right? Like, if somebody's going to get me, I don't care, whatever. And, you know, to some degree, I was in this success place, so I could be a little more confident about my relationship and being open about these dynamics. But there was still this sort of interesting pressure around it. But the positive feedback loop of these deep emotional conversations that I had with a number of people that were very successful reinforced my own desire to try to help eliminate the stigma associated with depression. The last comment on this thread is I have a very close friend who now lives in Boulder, lived in New York for many years, a guy named Jerry Colonna, who runs an organization called Reboot. And Jerry is very open about his own struggles with depression. He was one of the most successful VCs in the late 90s, early 2000 timeframe, and quit in 2002 and disappeared for 3 years. Became a Buddhist and has reinvented himself as one of the best CEO coaches in the world. But as part of that, he really had to go on his own journey. And it reinforced the importance for me of the value of that journey. And for me in that journey includes a continual relationship now with a therapist who's been extremely helpful. It's a guy in Boulder that works with high-performing people, entrepreneurs, and others. But also this continual exploration of changing things in my life and eliminating things in my life that are the stressors that cause me to get to this place where I'm depressive, or being able to read the dashboard when the yellow or red lights start lighting up and realize that the yellow and red lights are lighting up and I need to do something. The last part of that is just being part of a community and being more connected to other people who have struggled with anxiety and depression. And it's, you know, especially, it was mentioned earlier, the sort of dynamics around sexual assault and sexual harassment, which in my industry, both venture capital and entrepreneurship, is also front and center. I talk publicly about it now. I was sexually assaulted about 12 years ago. And the dynamics around PTSD, not just from your own experience from depression, but from any of these other traumas, and the sort of trigger dynamic around those traumas is something that as a 52-year-old hoping to live I'll take another 70 or 80 years, that would be good. Understanding how those things fit together in one's own self and what version of not just self-care but community is so important. The end result of that for me then becomes this notion of not trying to be a poster child for a successful person who struggles with depression, but acknowledging that so many successful people and also many people who never reach the success that they're aspiring for struggle with not just depression, but many other sort of trauma-related mental health issues, and that it's all of our responsibilities to try, in the context of making the world a better place, to make it more accessible, comfortable, and less stigmatized in the context of having it and addressing it.
You mentioned that you had a dashboard, that you're kind of looking at yourself, the red, the yellow, the green. I think that's a great analogy that we all need. I'm curious, how did the people who actually helped get you the help, how did they see your dashboard and how did they approach you? Because as one of the things we've talked about so openly tonight is the stigma. How do we approach it? How do I go up and say to you, hey, I think you're really awesome, but you need a little bit of help. You need a little bit of guidance, and I want to guide you into that place. Coupled with that, that's the external dashboard. You talk about your internal dashboard and being being aware of that, and I'm kind of combining two questions into one, because something else Brad talks about is mental fitness. Knowing your own red lights, knowing your own green lights. Can you talk about how somebody assessed your dashboard externally and how you manage it internally?
Yeah, so the external dynamics probably really only came into play in the most recent depressive episode, or the one in 2013, because in 1990, the only two people that, again, were tuned into this really were Dave and Amy. And they neither of them really knew what to do, but they were both incredibly supportive. In the one in 2001, everybody was screwed up, so that was a different issue. And this time around, a couple of things happened. When I started feeling depressed, my partners knew that I had struggled. My partners at Foundry and I were very open. We're best friends, so we're very emotionally aware of each other's states. And so we talked regularly about our struggles, and we talked about our histories and our struggles with our histories. So the idea that I struggle with anxiety, OCD, and depression was not a new thing for these people that I've been working with now for 12 years. So when I started to feel depressed, or when I acknowledged that I was feeling depressed at the beginning of January, I immediately started talking to my partners about it. And their first question was, what can we do to help? And my answer was, you don't need to do anything to help. I just need you to be aware that this is where I'm at. And I need you to give me space and not try to fix me and allow me to let time pass. And we ended up having a number of really powerful conversations around that, not just in that time period, but over subsequent time periods when some of my partners have struggled with their own anxieties and depression in different contexts. But that was a key thing, which is, don't fix me. I don't want you to fix me. I just want you to understand that I'm struggling with this and be supportive of me and give me space and accommodation for my struggle. In addition, somebody like Dave, who has known me for 30 years and probably knows me as well as anybody on this planet other than Amy, would do things that he knew I liked. So he knows I like to go for walks. And my favorite kind of meeting is a walking meeting, and I'm perfectly happy to go for, even if it's cold outside, put my coat on and go for a 30 or 60-minute walk. And so Dave would, and I'm pretty sure he colluded with my assistant, he would find out when I had some holes in my calendar. My assistant would block the holes in the calendar, and Dave would just show up in my office. He wouldn't call me and ask me to make a decision. He would just show up. And he'd show up in my office. He said, he wouldn't say, do you want to go for a walk? He'd say, let's go for a walk. And we'd go for a walk, and he wouldn't talk to me. He didn't want to fix me. There was no sort of lead on the conversation or agenda. And sometimes we talk, and sometimes things would tumble out, and other times we just have 60 minutes together as people who knew each other for a long time, doing a thing that he knew was good for me, that I knew was good for me, but that I doing in the context of self-care. Amy said the only thing she couldn't handle was suicidal ideation. If I had suicidal thoughts, that was the only thing that she couldn't handle. And so we set up a set of rules if I had any suicidal thoughts, which rule number 1 was immediately stop whatever you're doing. Rule number 2 is tell Amy, and tell her the thought, not just the, I was having it, but the thought. And that's ended up being a very useful construct for us, not just in suicidal ideation, but allows her to have a touch point with me where she says, do you feel safe? And when I think about what she does for me when I'm struggling, it's really create an environment where I feel safe. And that environment is not just the emotional one with her, but the physical environment in my house and with my dogs, and setting up a time where I'm not having to deal with other people, but I don't feel like I'm the one that's having to isolate myself. So those are the kinds of things that played out there. By the way, in both cases, when I went to therapy, the first time and then the more recent time, both of them were prompted by Amy pushing me to go to therapy because of the resistance, my programming from being a kid. And the first time I was very resistant to it, and the second time I was not resistant to it, but again, when you're in a depressive state, it's very hard to be proactive about anything. So that same kind of thing, knowing what would be good for me and not forcing, but nudging. The internal dashboard is fascinating. There's 2 elements to it. One is mental fitness, but before I go there, a year ago, I almost had another serious depressive, 2 years ago, sorry, I almost had another serious depressive episode. And I found myself in the beginning part of the year, January, February, traveling like crazy. And I came back from a trip on a Friday, and I said out loud to Amy, I feel depleted. And she said, do you feel depleted or do you feel depressed? And I said, I feel depressed. You know, I see it coming. And rather than wallow in that, I ended up taking action. And with my psychologist, we talked about this dynamic of, this was the first time that I noticed, before I became depressed, that the yellow and red lights on the cockpit were blinking. Right? Because I really wasn't depressed. I was able to sort of walk up to the edge of it. You know, I felt like I was getting depressed. One more week of that, and I would have been having a depressive episode. And so the awareness of that and the willingness to be open with somebody that I felt safe with about how I was feeling before I tumbled into this thing that, for me, I describe as the complete and total absence of joy. And I also describe it to people that have not been depressed as, there are no colors, there are gray, but there are no shades of gray. Everything is gray, right? It's literally just, that's what it feels like for me. The mental fitness side of it is, and I learned this through my own self-care, is I immediately start running experiments. I'm an engineer, right? And so I start running experiments on me. The first, there's a blog post that I wrote about March where I listed off a number of things I stopped doing. An example is, until then, I was one of those people that gets up at 5 o'clock in the morning, no matter where I am, no matter how much sleep I had the night before. And I decided to stop waking up with an alarm clock. So I just shifted my day so it started at 11. And for 6 months, I slept at least 12 hours every night. That's how tired I was, right? I stopped drinking alcohol, I stopped drinking caffeine. I started taking Saturday off, something I call digital Sabbath. So from Friday night to Saturday night, I'm an atheist, but you know, I can carry some of the Jewish traditions forward. I love to read. And so I stopped watching TV, and instead of watching TV, I would just read. So a whole series of things like this that I knew were good for me in the context of this. And as part of it, I started to use my psychologist as a coach around fitness, the same way I have a running coach. Right? Foundry Group, we have a coach for us that works with us as investors and as leaders. And I sort of said, you know, I need a mental fitness coach. I need help. You know, my running coach has been amazing, but I need help like thinking through how to do things that are actually going to work for me versus just sitting in therapy and trying to work through why am I getting depressed. And so I changed that dynamic a lot for me. And it's resulted in a number of long-standing life changes. I no longer wake up with an alarm clock. That's a big one. I sleep, instead of sleeping 5 to 6 hours a night during the week and binge sleeping on the weekend, I usually sleep 7 to 8, sometimes 9 hours, every night. And I feel remarkably better than I did when I was convincing myself that I was catching up on the weekends or on airplanes. I decided last year to stop drinking alcohol. I've never had a problem with alcohol, and I've had periods of time in my life where I went through phases where I didn't drink. I had gout problems in the early 2000s. I weighed about 240 pounds, and I was really struggling with trying to deal with gout with my diet. And eventually, I tried several years not drinking, and I lost some weight, but the gout didn't really go away until I started taking medication. But when I decided to stop drinking a year ago, after a year of it, I'm like, you know what? Alcohol is not good for me. And if you struggle with depression, you know that alcohol is a depressant. But for me specifically, it really had this accelerating effect. And so in this notion of mental fitness, deciding that there were things that I was willing to just consciously change, but also experiment with as I was trying to figure out what worked and what didn't. I tried to change the language on some of my writing around this to mental fitness instead of mental health, and it's interesting. It's a good phrase, but people bounce off it. It doesn't get to the stigma. It's almost like you're glossing over the stigma. So I use it as a positive encouragement of we should all work on our mental fitness, but part of that is destigmatizing the issues around struggling with your mental health.
So I'm curious with your story, I know this wasn't one of our questions, but you have been very open with this. You've been open with your story, you've been open with your journey, and you've been open with the resources that you provide your employees at your company. How has this changed how you view people? And when you meet somebody who you know is openly struggling, how do you deal with them? And what do? You're in a room with 200 plus people here. You've now made yourself approachable by telling your story. Whether directly or indirectly, because now you've created that familiarity bond. How has that changed the way that you interact with people? Because ideally our goal is to send all of these people out as ambassadors for mental health wellness, for advocacy, and for being able to positively affect change in their own lives. So how has your journey changed how you're going to interact and how you do interact with people?
Fun question. The first thing that happened, and this I think for me was a result of having the 100 plus people reach out to me. I have always known that as an entrepreneur, my peers, and then as an investor, the entrepreneurs that I work with, the vast majority of them labor under enormous stress and have continuous anxiety. And if anybody's ever been involved in a startup, the uncertainty and unknowns are continuous. And you can have an awesome day followed by an awful day. You can have an awesome hour followed by an awful hour. And I think always empathetic to that. And I think as an investor, it's one of the things that's caused my partners and I to be successful is that we are empathetic to that dynamic versus detached emotionally from it. What it caused me to do was be even more emotionally connected to the CEOs and the founders that I work with and people on the leadership team. And by modeling behavior publicly, that you could be high achieving and struggle with these things and that was okay. And that denying the struggle or suffering under the weight of the stigma simply made your ability to cope with the stressors even harder. So step one was modeling the behavior, but then linking it empathetically to my interactions with people. The second is, I'm very aware that when I'm struggling, I actually don't want people to try to fix me. I'm sure everybody in this room has heard different versions of shake it off, right? Or, just smile, it'll be great. And Amy loves to do the Marge Simpson, just push all that shit down to your toes and bring up a big smile. It's not just not helpful, it's unhelpful, and in some cases profoundly unhelpful. And I think that's helped me in my interaction. Instead of saying, hey, what can I do to help you? I just gave you another decision you have to make. and you already don't have the capacity to make any more decisions, or maybe you don't want to make any more decisions, but I just put the burden on you. So the change of behavior is to be an absorber of that. And a language I use today in my professional life is that I've always had the capacity to handle a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety. I've learned how to metabolize a lot. And I've learned how to metabolize not just my own stress and anxiety, but the stress and anxiety around me through my behavior. The problem if you have too much of it is there's a finite amount you metabolize. Like I get better every year, I can handle more and more, but you still hit a limit. And so self-care is such that you have to give yourself the time and space so that you actually can do that. And I've seen this with many people, especially people who put themselves out as some version of coach, psychiatrist, psychologist, mental health provider engaged in this, which is that you absorb so much, but you don't give yourself time. And that's another big part of how I've tried to relate to people, which is I'm available. My email is brad@feld.com. I'm happy to get emails and respond and interact. My request, I get 500 a day. Please start with the punchline. You're probably going to get somewhere between a word and a sentence back from me. I'm very good at saying no. But if I could be helpful, I try to be. But I don't have time for a meeting, and I don't have time for coffee, and I can't get together. And I've learned that I used to do a lot of that, and it depletes me so much that I don't have the ability to do the other things. So I think some of it is also as an individual. Some of you are extroverts, so getting together with people builds you up. I'm an introvert, so an evening like this is I'm comfortable and happy to do it, but it drains my tank. And I need to make sure that I do things that keeps my tank back filled up. So just being aware of that with yourself, so that your tank is constantly being filled, but also with the people you're engaging with, to make sure that your interaction with them is actually neutral to positive to them, versus you think you're helping, but it's negative.
I think that's so true. As this group is such a group of high achievers, we don't take time for ourselves. We don't say no. You all are out here on a Wednesday night, and it's very appreciated. I know many of you came from work, other meetings, etc. So that is probably the best advice, is that we start taking time for ourselves. To be aware.
You know what, I want to make one last comment on this thread, mental fitness and self-help. After the last election, I deleted Facebook and Twitter from my phone. I've always been very engaged with social media. I invest in this stuff. I use this stuff. It's part of my world. I have a very big presence in this. And I still broadcast. So if you follow me on Twitter, you'll see tweets. But I am tweeting out stuff, not even using Twitter as an app. I use an app called Buffer. But I'm not engaging interactively with it. I'm not consuming things. And Facebook was even more difficult for me, partly because I didn't really ever feel like it got integrated well into my life. And so the dynamic of Facebook being this happy place that was an artificial happy place for everybody, and how awesome they were, especially when you knew the people that were super awesome in Facebook were super not awesome in real life. So I always struggled with that. So I deleted them and just said, I'm out. I'm out. And what I did was, I don't know how much time it actually was cumulatively throughout the day. It probably wasn't that much time. But it was an enormous amount of cognitive overhead. It was like that OCD overhead. You know, the constant like looking at. And those spare moments, like when we were together beforehand for 15 minutes, like you were very present, I was very present, we were talking to each other as humans. We don't know each other at all, but we had 15 minutes where we actually engaged.
We're best friends now.
Where we really engaged. And that's another part of my own learning, is that I really like to engage one-on-one. Ideal number of people for me to engage with max is 4, although I have now 6 other partners, so I have to say 7 people is kind of the max. But once it gets bigger than that, it's not healthy for me. And if I go out to dinner and there's 8 people at dinner, I've learned that I'm going to focus on the person sitting on either side of me. Not try to engage with the whole table, because I can't. It's not healthy for me. It's not healthy for me to try to engage with hundreds of thousands of random people online. That even if they want to engage with me, I'm happy to broadcast to them, right? So now I'm not suggesting that everybody delete Facebook and Twitter from their phone, although consider it. Like take a month off. Just take a month off and see how it changes. Because I think one of the things that's caused so much anxiety in our society right now is this sort of continual blurring of physical presence and online presence, and the switching between those two, combined with the toxicity of so much of the stuff that you're seeing. And it's not, ignore everything. Like, this is a room full of smart people. You want to be informed citizens, but there's a difference between being informed citizens and being obsessed about the latest stupid thing that Voldemort said.
That is so true. Now, how many people in here know who Voldemort is? Let's see. All right, Harry Potter fans. I want to be aware of Brad's time because, as he shared earlier with me, his wife is leaving on a trip tomorrow. So I have one final question for you. About 2 years ago, we started the In My Mind campaign, and really what that was is it's our vision for what we're hoping the future will hold for mental health, mental wellness, substance abuse, the entire community health as a whole. And so you've seen these banners hanging around with little snippets of what our hope is. And Brad said, and I'm going to read it here, that, actually I'll read it over there, the stigma associated with depression and mental health issues vanishes. Tell me what the future looks like in order for that to happen. What comes next for all of us?
Yeah, so my dad was an endocrinologist, and one of the major things that endocrinologist addresses is diabetes. And so as a kid, I was exposed to diabetes, many of his patients. And when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, let's put it in that time period, diabetes was a very not well understood thing. And as insulin pumps started to appear, there were these big things, and people had these big things, and they had to get their blood multiple times a day, and it was not a particularly comfortable thing to be around when you started to interact with somebody that had diabetes. Amy's boyfriend prior to me, who was also a close friend of mine, lived together in fraternity, was a hemophiliac. And we were in college between 83 and 87 as undergrads, and if you know that time frame, that was when HIV and AIDS, this incredibly mysterious thing, appeared. And virtually 100% of hemophiliacs developed HIV because of the blood supply. It turns out that while HIV that developed AIDS, if you were typically male homosexual, was at that period of time high risk of death in some time period. It turned out for hemophiliacs that the vast majority of those hemophiliacs lived, and Bruce's name is still alive today, because their immune system was compromised in a different way, and there's science that I don't know today, but it was this period of time where the stigma associated with HIV and AIDS and then subsequently being homosexual was extraordinary. And so those, as a developing adult, right, sort of teenager, young adult, those were two stigmas that stay with me, that I really understand. There's plenty of others, but those, I was a bookworm and a nerd, so I had to deal with that growing up, but I was also a pretty good athlete, right, so you sort of have these balancing things, but those two really stood out for me. And I saw them in some ways different than many of our other social struggles. Ethnicity, racism, sexism, like these were issues too, but it was a different flavor of, and in some cases a worse issue, but it was a different flavor than this stigma that caused people to hide from what was going on, where that hiding from what was going on accelerated in a negative way your own ability to deal with the issue. Certainly for me, but then I started to understand it. I don't want to minimize sexism, I don't want to minimize racism, I don't want to minimize any of those things. But in some ways it felt very similar to me to the stigma associated with HIV and AIDS and the mysteriousness of it and people's inability, not just to sort of address the issue, but like all of a sudden, I don't know, I want to be near you. I don't want to be infected by your mental health.
Fear.
Right? It's fear-based. And those stuck with me. And when in 2013, against the backdrop of people that committed suicide that didn't need to commit suicide, I mean, they chose to, but it was clearly because of their inability in this context of entrepreneurship to even talk to anybody about this because of fear, shame, the same kind of feelings I had in my 20s, combined with this very, very long list of people, very accomplished, many with enormous resources, who had submerged themselves. Like they refused to acknowledge that they could have an impact on this because they were afraid of what it meant for them to be open about it. And there's some really, really brave people that have been very open. There's I'll call him a friend. We've spent a little bit of time together, but from a distance mostly. A guy in Boston named Paul English, that was the founder of Kayak. And Tracy Kidder, who's one of my favorite authors, wrote a book about Paul a year or two ago called A Truck Full of Money. And it's a fabulous book. And it's ostensibly the book about Paul, but it's really about Paul's open struggle with being bipolar as an entrepreneur. And if you want a current short version of this, there was just a Bostonian magazine, or Boston magazine, just had an issue talking about Paul. So if you type Boston magazine, Paul English, in the news and Google, it'll come up. And it's a short version of it, but the Tracy Kidder book is magnificent, and I'd recommend it. Same kind of thing, like Paul's willingness as a very successful entrepreneur to very openly talk about his struggle with bipolar and how bipolar both makes him great and awful. And how getting the right meds is an important part of it. And he's willing to experiment with it because he wants the great and he knows he's going to have some of the awful, but he doesn't want as much of the awful. Right? And so sort of working through these things, what that shifted me to was this notion of, if you can imagine a world where we didn't, people who struggled with, pick your anxiety disorder, pick your depressive disorder, pick your mania, didn't have the stigma inhibiting them from going on their own self-improvement journey to make their lives and the lives around them better, against the backdrop of whatever they've got. I mean, some people have diabetes, and some people have, you get cancer. Cancer used to have terrible stigma associated with it. Today, breast cancer is almost, as long as it's caught early enough, is almost treatable. Right, so it feels like mental health, which impacts so many of us. I would like to see a future where we actually viewed it as something that we worked on as humans, rather than actively tried to hide or were afraid of as humans. Yeah.
Well, this has been a very informative talk, and we thank you very much. And we'd like to open it up to about 2 or 3 questions, if there are any in the audience. Feel free. Judy?
So I want to just point out that diabetes care is covered, and cancer care is covered, and mental health care is not covered. I'm a general pediatrician.
Yep.
I can't even begin to tell you the struggles of getting people into treatment once they agree that they're even going to consider it. So particularly, I work in Douglas County, cowboy type of mentality, and not only can you not get covered, but you have to ask a young person, a teenager who's already ashamed and scared, to try maybe 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 therapists, or their parent wants to go on what's covered, and that therapist is in Arvada, and somehow that's okay. So I would love to see, and we're in the right place to ask that question. So we've got All Health Network, but it is a process getting through that, and they don't take all comers. So I think that's a big difference.
I'm very aware of that, and I think that's a powerful comment. I'll give an example, something we were talking about earlier. Amy's on the board of the BCH Foundation. We are, with a number of other people, funding a new building and an endowment to support it that will be half of the facility is dedicated to essentially 72-hour inpatient site because insurance doesn't cover it. And so if you have a manic episode, or you have an addiction-related episode, or just a severe depression, you kind of have two choices in Boulder County right now, and also for much of Denver. You can go to jail, or you can go to the emergency room. And neither of those are the right place to go when you're in that sort of situation. And it's gotten obviously much worse versus much better. Now, interestingly, I don't have any illusions that I know how to fix the healthcare system. My father, however, does, as a retired endocrinologist. And if you'd like to read about that, his blog is at stan.feld.com. But I think your point is an important one, which is in our current society, in some ways, private philanthropy and other sources of support versus either insurance dollars or government funding is a critical thing to augment this as part of the change. Now, privilege is an interesting thing, right? I see a therapist, I have privilege, I have plenty of money. The very first question he asked me was, do you want me to put this on your insurance or not? If it goes on your insurance, it's going to be on your record, and whatever. And the rules are such now that I can't guarantee that nobody would ever see that you saw a psychologist. And I'd never even thought about that. And I said, it doesn't matter, just don't charge my insurance. I don't even know what my insurance covers. It probably covers 4 visits, right? So it's not even worth doing. But you have these other layers of problems too. So I think your point's a really important one, in not just the frame of reference of addressing how people feel, but structurally how our society deals with this.
It's wonderful for all health to respond to that shooting, but it would have been nice if that man could have had care in advance of that. And I understand it's not every situation, it takes the individual, but we're on the back end of this a lot.
Brad, your vulnerability has been incredible and it's inspiring. What would your coaching be around encouraging others that struggle with, or ourselves really, that struggle with mental health, be around being more vulnerable and getting rid of that stigma?
Yeah, I think vulnerability is a very tricky word because it has a wide range of where people sit. And I used the word privilege earlier. Jerry Colonna at Reboot does CEO boot camps, and he and I started sponsoring and co-hosting a VC boot camp where 20 VCs would get together for 4 days and go very deep on the Reboot promise is practical skills development plus radical self-inquiry. The comment is, if you just want to do practical skills development, watch videos. If you just want to do radical self-inquiry, do therapy. If you want to be a great CEO, you got to combine the two. So you got to go deep on the intersection point. And in one of these VC boot camps, somebody said, well, that's easy for you, Brad, you're bulletproof. Right? As though, like nobody can get to me. Well, I'm not bulletproof, and stuff gets to me. But I've chosen on the spectrum to not let what other people's response or attack on me being open about what my reality is get to me. And there are this idea of understanding where one is on that has a lot to do with what you're comfortable with. Personally, I think the more we're able to be vulnerable about ourselves, the easier it is to deal with difficult things. Just that's my view. But it's not something I would impose on anybody. And so defining sort of where you are on the spectrum and what it means to you to be vulnerable. It's a big difference between writing something on the internet that anybody can read and anybody can do anything with. And putting something in your personal Facebook feed that's private and there's a certain number of people that see it versus talking to your significant other or your family or whatever. So it's sort of picking that carefully is important. If anybody here has ever been in a deposition, You know that anything you write that's on the internet is going to come at you in that deposition. And that's a pretty fucked up thing if you write about depression. Like you're in a deposition where you're an expert witness and somebody says, well, can you have a credible thought about this thing? Because you publicly here said you were depressed. I'm like, well, let's talk about that, right? And that's not what lawyers want to hear, but they're going to have to listen, right? So I'm willing to do that, but it's not bulletproof, right? So it's figuring out where you sit in that. And I think, kind of said this earlier, it's not imposing it. It's finding your own sense of what is nourishing to you. It's a word I like to use. And again, I didn't know that this kind of conversation and my willingness to be open about this stuff would be nourishing or helpful to me. I would say it's neutral to positive for me, but not like extraordinarily positive. But because it's neutral to positive and that's important to me, it's easy to do. Versus if it wasn't important to me, I wouldn't do it. So it's figuring out all those pieces and putting them together in a logical way. Hope that helps.
Thank you.
We can take one more question and then we'll wrap up.
I'm Bianca Delozo. I'm a strategic interventionist trained by Tony Robbins and Phil Medan's training center. My specialty is in emotional mastery and relationship trauma things, but also mental toughness for business leaders. You spoke about one main takeaway that I think for us as ambassadors through All Health Network, and I just want to reassure that if this is your main takeaway for us to apply in our families, communities, and business environment as well. You spoke about if there is anything that we can do to help others, not to approach as fixing, because we are not broken. There is something about that that is so important for us to take away. If our approach is coming in, how can I help in a way to understand your world and where you're at, and meeting you where you're at, and showing resources available through All Health Network or in the community, that just opens up so much from the one that is seeking help and doesn't even know where to begin in sharing and being vulnerable. And is that the main takeaway that
I'll play it back so people in the back can hear it, because I think you summarized it really well. The two words you talked about were the difference between helping someone and fixing someone.
Yes, right.
And the idea that fixing is not good language because the person is not broken. And if you want to link this to eliminating stigma, right? Eliminating that whole line of thinking, right? We are humans. We are all big bags of chemicals. That's what we are.
blind spots?
Right. Sometimes we're a product of the interaction of our chemicals and our history and how all that stuff works, and we interact with other people's chemicals, and all of that stuff, a lot of it's out of our control in terms of what's happening to those chemicals at any moment in time. You know, everybody, like the simple thing, right? If you don't eat for 24 hours, your chemicals are very different than if you eat the right stuff over 24 hours. If you don't sleep, your chemicals are very different. And so this notion that we're all these very sort of dynamic systems versus if you're struggling with one of these things, you're broken. And shifting away from that language completely and going to the language of, or the idea of meeting somebody where they are and trying to be helpful to them wherever they are. And sometimes, as I described with my partner Dave, for my first business, it's knowing what that person likes and what that will be good for the person. In his case, he knew that if he made me make a decision, that was just adding to my struggle, and so he made the decision for me. And then even in the context of making a decision for me, he came to me versus making me do something. And so I think that's, I take away whatever you want from today, but I think that's really well said as a summary. Shifting away from fix and broken to the idea of help and meeting the person where they are and what they need versus what you think they need or what you think will make them better.
Having an advocate versus a repairman. Now, with that, I would like to thank Brad. We've gone over his time, and we'd like you all to start the conversation. And hopefully you will start talking with the people next to you. Brad, you have been inspirational. You have been motivating. I encourage you all to follow him on every media out there because it's phenomenal. So please join me in thanking Brad.